Everybody. Okay. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. My name is Shoaib Akram, and today I will talk about garbage collection for hybrid memories that aim to make persistent storage technologies more practical as main memory. And this is joint work with my collaborators, Jennifer Sarter from Ghent University and Free University in Brussels, and Catherine McKinley at Google, and my advisor, Lee Winnicott at Ghent University. So this talk is about main memory. And we have been using DRAM as main memory, as a primary memory in our system for several decades. But we cannot rely on DRAM alone to fulfill all of our future needs. The manufacturing process is becoming complex, which is increasing the cost per gigabit. DRAM consumes a lot of energy, especially as we scale up memory. And reliability is becoming a concern as the stored charge becomes smaller and smaller. And this is happening at a time when we have lots of cores to run lots of applications that all need a lot of memory. At the same time, some persistent storage technologies have emerged, and phase-change memory, or PCM, is the most promising and the one that is already in production. It is persistent like disk and byte addressable like DRAM, so it can serve both roles of storage and main memory. But as main memory, it does have two drawbacks. First of all, the latency is higher than DRAM. But what is the subject of this talk is it has limited write endurance. That is, if you write a PCM cell a finite number of times, it wears out. And why is that? Because PCM is a resistive technology, so you have to raise the temperature to a very high level to change the resistance of the PCM cell so you can represent 1 and 0. And by doing this over time, the PCM cell eventually wears out. So if we replace all the DRAM in our system with PCM, what this graph is showing, that Java applications would wear out a realistic 32 gigabyte PCM prototype in less than 2 years on average. And so the y-axis is lifetime in years, and I will explain the methodology in the later part of the presentation. So we cannot replace all of the DRAM with PCM. We need something in front of PCM to absorb writes. So hybrid memories not only compensate for the high latency of PCM, but they also provide high endurance. So if you manage hybrid memory properly, which consists of DRAM and PCM, you get low latency, low energy, high capacity, and high endurance. But the challenges are somehow we need to bridge this latency gap between DRAM and PCM. And again, what is the subject of this talk is somehow we need to make the memory last tens of years by mitigating wear out. So I have already told you hardware wear leveling alone, that wear leveling spreads right out across the entire PCM capacity. And if you just rely on that and replace all of your DRAM with PCM, that alone is not enough. So somehow we need to limit writes to PCM. And what the prior operating system approaches do, they identify and migrate highly written pages to DRAM. Now these approaches have several disadvantages. First of all, you are moving a few kilobytes of information. So even if a line on a page is highly written, the operating system will move the entire page to DRAM. And if the line is no longer being written, the operating system will move it back to PCM. So you see that there is a lot of data movement in the system, which is not efficient, and also page migrations themselves become a source of writes. What we do in this work is we exploit the managed runtime in languages such as Java or C# to limit writes to PCM. So as you may know, a major advantage of managed runtime is garbage collection. And what the garbage collection does, it not only relieves a programmer from the responsibility of manually managing memory, but it also does a few things to improve the efficiency of the memory system. For instance, it reduces fragmentation, it improves cache locality, and to do those things, it moves objects around. And in this work, we use the garbage collector to move objects to the right type of memory, the highly written objects to DRAM, and the rest in PCM. And this way, we are able to exploit PCM's capacity by putting a lot of objects in PCM and a few highly written objects that hurt the lifetime of PCM in DRAM. So first, let's start with understanding the distribution of writes to a managed or a garbage collected heap. So most high-performance collectors today use the generational heap organization that I'm showing there. So all the initial allocation happens in the young generation called the nursery. And when the nursery is full, the garbage collector performs a collection cycle and moves the surviving objects, copies the surviving objects to the mature space. And what we found out for 16 Java applications from 3 diverse suites, majority of the writes, 70% of the writes, happen to young objects in the nursery. And this was not all that surprising. Whenever programmer allocates an object, they use the constructor to initialize the fields. Also, Java semantics enforce zero initializing memory before fresh allocation for safety reasons. So that's why we expected and we observed that a majority of the writes happened to nursery. What was surprising was that of the remaining 30% of the writes, a majority of the writes are absorbed by a small number of objects. So on average, 22% of the writes are concentrated in 2% of the objects. This reveals a great opportunity. If we can put nursery, which is a few megabytes in size, and this 2% of mature objects in DRAM, we can improve the overall endurance of the memory system. And because the mature generation is very large for most applications, we can exploit PCM's capacity by putting a majority of the heap in PCM. So to take advantage of this opportunity, we propose write-rationing garbage collectors that protect PCM from nursery writes and majority of the mature writes. So write-rationing garbage collectors concentrate most writes in DRAM. And we propose 2 versions of write-rationing garbage collectors. The simpler one, called Kingsguard Nursery, protect PCM from nursery writes. But we found out that for many Java applications, this simple version of write-rationing garbage collector is not sufficient. They would still wear out a 32 gigabyte PCM in less than 10 years. So we have to be more aggressive, and for that we propose Kingsguard writers that not only protects PCM from the nursery writes, but also from majority of the mature object writes. So first I will explain the simpler write-rationing collector, Kingsguard Nursery. So this is how the heap organization looks like in DRAM today. In addition to the nursery and the mature space that I talked about earlier, we also have a large object space. And the reason for that is because we don't want to copy large arrays that are a few kilobytes in size from nursery to the mature space if they survive. We want to directly allocate them in the large object space. And most standard collectors do that. And so if we first allocate the large object in the nursery, it leads to performance overhead if we then have to copy it to PCM. So what Kingsguard Nursery does, in this case, we re-engineer the Java Virtual Machine's memory manager to map nursery virtual pages physically in DRAM and the rest of the pages in PCM. And this way, we are able to protect the PCM from writes. So these are simple changes to the Java Virtual Machine, but they lead to very high, a great improvement in PCM lifetime. But as I said earlier, this alone is not enough to protect PCM from all writes. So how does Kingsguard writers work? Again, because the nursery is highly mutated, we start with the nursery in DRAM. But instead of copying nursery survivors to PCM, we have an intermediate observer space. And the purpose of the observer space is to monitor writes to objects. So while an object is in the observer space, we monitor the writes to it. And we know that because of the distribution of the writes, a few objects will get a lot of writes. And what we do then is we move these objects to the mature space in DRAM. So our mature space is split between DRAM and PCM. So a few highly mutated objects are in DRAM. And to exploit PCM's capacity, we place all the remaining objects in PCM. It may happen that the garbage collector mispredicts, and some objects that are moved to the PCM mature space are eventually highly written. And during the full heap collection cycle, before a full heap collection cycle, we continue to monitor all the non-nursery objects, the writes to all the non-nursery objects, and during a full heap collection, we move such objects that are highly written and in PCM to DRAM, to the DRAM mature space. And vice versa. If we have an object in DRAM that is no longer highly written, we move it to the PCM mature space. And how do we handle large objects? Well, to exploit PCM capacity, we initially allocate all large objects in PCM. But again, during a full heap collection cycle, if we discover that some large objects are highly written, we move them to the large space in DRAM. So we split the mature space and the large space across DRAM and PCM, and we move objects around. So eventually we have a system which has a long lifetime and where we are exploiting the capacity advantage of PCM. So how do we monitor writes to objects? Well, we use the write barrier. So on each write to an object, the write barrier does some extra work, and basically it sets a bit in the object's header to mark the object as written or highly written. And we have two write barrier configurations. In one configuration, we only monitor references, and this configuration does not have very high overhead for generational collectors because generational collectors already use a write barrier for tracking pointers from mature to the young space. And in the second barrier configuration, we monitor both references and primitives. And this configuration has slightly larger overhead, but it delivers very high lifetimes because we are able to monitor every single write that happened to the non-nursery objects. So in addition to these optimizations, we do two additional optimizations in Kingsguard writers. The first one is selectively allocating some large objects in DRAM. And the reason for that is, for some applications, we observed that they allocate a lot of large objects. And because by default, we allocate large objects in PCM, these allocations leave behind dirty cache lines, and eventually they lead to writes to PCM. And we want to protect the PCM from these writes. So if we can just choose some large objects and put them in the nursery, and if they follow the generational hypothesis and they die, then we can improve PCM lifetime even further. And the second optimization is we decouple the mark state metadata from the object header and put it in DRAM. And the reason for that is because during a full heap collection cycle, as the garbage collector goes through all the PCM objects, it marks them live, and this marking of live bits also makes some cache lines dirty and leads to PCM writes. And we want to protect the PCM from GC updates to the metadata. So here is how the large object optimization works. If we observe that the write rate to PCM is very high, and if the object is larger than a threshold but can still fit in one half of the remaining nursery, we will try to allocate it in the nursery. And the reason we don't allocate an object larger than one half of the nursery in the nursery is because it might increase the frequency of nursery collections. So one large object, a few large objects can occupy the nursery, and it will lead to a lot of nursery collections. And all the remaining large objects still go to PCM. And this optimization for some applications is very useful in improving lifetime and reducing write rates. And we monitor the write rates to PCM, and we turn this optimization on and off dynamically. So for the metadata optimization, please refer to the paper. I'm not talking about it here in interest of time. So what is the impact on PCM lifetimes and energy and write rates of doing all these optimizations? So I will show you two sets of results. The first set are measurements on real hardware, and the second one uses a simulator. And for both sets of results, I'm using the JIX Research Virtual Machine and Java applications. So what is my real hardware methodology? Well, I use the write barriers to count writes to the mutator or the application writes to objects in an architecture-independent manner. And because this is on a real machine, I'm using 12 da capo applications, 3 applications from the GraphG framework. And the reason to use these applications is because they have very large heaps, and they represent modern graph applications. and sudo JBB, which is a well-known Java benchmark. So in the first set of results, the first configuration that I use is the simpler write-rationing collector Kingsguard nursery with a 4 megabyte nursery. Kingsguard writers with a 4 megabyte nursery and an 8 megabyte observer space. And we experimentally verified that setting the observer space to be twice as large as the nursery leads to a good compromise between PCM writes and the collection overhead of collecting the observer space. But because Kingsguard writers here is using more DRAM than Kingsguard nursery, I will also show you results of a configuration where Kingsguard nursery uses a bigger nursery. So the two Kingsguard writers and nursery use the same amount of DRAM. So this is the result. This is the graph that shows the reduction in PCM writes on the y-axis for the 3 suites. And what we see here is that, as we expected, Kingsguard nursery eliminates 70% of the mutator writes or the application writes. And if you KGN 12 bar shows what if you use a simpler Kingsguard nursery but use a bigger nursery? Does it solve the problem? Well, no. It only eliminates 6% more writes. And this is less than the writes that Kingsguard writer saves, which is 95% of all writes to PCM. So by using Kingsguard writers, we eliminate 95% of the mutator writes to PCM and concentrate them in DRAM. Because I cannot simulate the long-running benchmarks, they run for a few minutes natively, so it takes them to run a few weeks on a simulator. I'm only showing you results for 7 da capo applications. And the reason to use a simulator is to get energy measurements and lifetime measurements and write rates for these 7 da capo applications. But since we did this work, we developed an emulation platform using NUMA hardware, and all the findings that I will show you here are confirmed by the emulation results. So these are my 3 memory systems that I simulate. The hybrid memory system uses a small amount of DRAM, and the idea here is to eliminate most of the standby power that DRAM consumes. And for capacity, use PCM, which has almost negligible standby power. And this is on a 32-core machine, and I'm using 1 gigabyte per core of memory for the homogeneous systems that are DRAM only and PCM only. And the PCM parameters here are chosen from prior work. In terms of lifetime, this graph is showing lifetime in years on the y-axis. What we see is that, as I showed earlier in the slides, PCM only is impractical. It doesn't last on average for 2 years. And by using Kingsguard nursery, by eliminating all nursery writes, it leads to an average lifetime across 7 applications of 9 years. But several applications still have a lifetime of less than 10 years. And by using writers, we have an average memory lifetime of 17 years, and several applications would not wear PCM out in 10 years. And so what it is showing is that by using hybrid memory and using the garbage collection to limit writes to PCM leads to a practical memory system that has some amount of DRAM and a lot of PCM. And why does the lifetimes improve? Well, because we bring down the PCM write rates by a large fraction. So on average, on the y-axis here, the PCM write rate of PCM only is 10 gigabyte per second, which is very high. And with Kingsguard writers, the average write rate is less than 1 gigabyte per second. And this translates into very long PCM lifetimes. So what about energy efficiency of a hybrid memory system? This graph compares, uses energy delay product, which is the product of energy and execution time, to quantify energy efficiency. And this graph is relative to DRAM only. So if I replace all the DRAM in my system with PCM, does it lead to a more energy efficient execution? For some applications, yes. For other applications, no. For example, LU search that writes a lot to PCM actually makes the system less energy efficient because PCM write energy is very high. And for applications like Antler and Blot, because we are getting rid of all the DRAM standby power, they lead to running them on a hybrid memory system, on a PCM only system, is more energy efficient. What is interesting is that if you use a hybrid memory system and you use garbage collection to limit writes to PCM, the EDP, or the energy efficiency, is 35% better compared to a compared to a DRAM-only system. So compared to a DRAM-only system, a hybrid memory system is 35% more energy efficient. We have a lot of other results in the paper. We have execution time results, both in the simulator and on the real machine. We show a breakdown of some of the overheads that we introduced in Kingsguard writers, the observer collections, the extra pointer tracking, and stuff like that, and the PCM latency. And we talk about the survival rates of objects in the observer space and in other spaces. And we also quantitatively compared to prior OS approaches in terms of lifetime and execution time. So I refer to the paper for all of these things. To conclude, we have proposed write-rationing garbage collection for hybrid memories that monitor fine-grained behavior of objects, and we use the garbage collector to place highly written objects in DRAM and the rest in PCM. And this way, we are able to exploit PCM's capacity, and we are able to improve the overall lifetime of the memory system by more than an order of magnitude. Thank you, and I'll take any questions.
Again, just raise your hand, and the microphone will come to you. We've got one over there.
Sure, very nice. I thought it was sort of a brilliant use of the generational GC to solve the critical problem of persistent memory. The use of nursery, it's really as a type of cache, right? The objects as a stored in DRAM to cache the writes. So if I view that as a cache concept, then there are problems that how to choose the right cache size to maximize the effect of the write caching. Mm-hmm. So there was work in write locality, basically to find out the trade-off between the cache size and the amount of writes. That's sort of a write-backs. Mm-hmm. I wonder in your work whether you have the same issue and how you choose the nursery size.
Well, normally the nursery size in these runtimes is decided based upon how much the user is able to, based on user constraints on pause time. So you try a few nursery sizes for an application, and if it is more than a few milliseconds, that is the user's SLA. So this is how nurseries are sized, and this is how we size the nursery. So the 4 megabyte is from prior work, and in our future work, we do have some sensitivity studies. But just using a large nursery does not solve the problem. Nursery fills up quickly, and when you collect a nursery, you will put all the remaining objects in PCM, and they will be highly written. So you have to have an intermediate space to monitor objects. But in terms of sizing the nursery, that's a separate problem. That depends on the user, on the application, on how much you are able to endure the pause time and things like that.
Thanks. Interesting talk. I feel like I'm missing something, though. So I thought one of the main points of PCM was to provide durability. And it seems like if you're absorbing writes in DRAM, then you're kind of intrinsically losing durability. And you're sort of automatically deciding whether to move things to a durable memory or not based on performance, which is cool. But it seems like in general, well, if you have a policy for durability, then maybe you should just use that to decide where to put objects.
So this is so there are different roles that PCM will play. This is about main memory, where the user does not care about durability, and then you have storage and persistent object storage, and where the programmer tries to tells the runtime to persist certain objects, which happens in databases. And so here we are just exploring PCM as a pure DRAM replacement, where the user does not care about durability. And we are only using it for its scalability features, that we can have a very large capacity, and yes, if you need to use it as persistent storage, then there are works that look into that.
We have 2 more questions.
Steve Blackburn, ANU. Quick question. Do you consider writes other than heap writes? So, for example, the stacks are a source of memory writes. Do you consider that in your analysis?
Not the analysis as showed here. You said stack?
Stack. So writes to the stack. I'm wondering what fraction of writes go to the stack and whether or not you consider that in your analysis.
Not the analysis as show, but because stack is not very big, we place all of that stuff in DRAM by default.
And then this will be our last question. We've got time for one more over here.
You took advantage of the generational garbage collection in a very interesting way, and I thought that was great. But are you letting an old generation collection happen and all of those writes that are piling on your memory that you're trying to prevent writes to by compacting the old generation?
Sorry, I didn't get the question. So the question is that...
Are you allowing old generation collections, right? Are you going to compact all those objects in that area of memory that you're trying to minimize writes in?
So in this particular collector, we turned off any defragmentation features, and the idea is that because you have a lot of PCM capacity, you don't need as much defragmentation.